Disabled veteran sentenced to death until her loyal German shepherd reveals a shocking truth. Long breath escaped the lips of the woman seated at the defendant's table. Now her name was Captain Alina Morozova, a decorated combat medic, who had served in 2 grueling deployments in Syria before a roadside bomb stole her leg and a piece of her soul. Her uniform had once drawn salutes. Now it drew whispers. She sat tall in her wheelchair, eyes focused, heart hammering. After reviewing the evidence presented, said Judge Viktor Kuznetsov, his voice grim, as court finds the defendant guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Colonel Ilya Sokolov. A gasp rolled through the room like thunder. Lena didn't move. She didn't cry. She didn't even blink. Only the deepening of her grip on the arms of her wheelchair betrayed any emotion. She had prepared herself for this. She had been preparing since the day the police showed up at her apartment with handcuffs and cold eyes. The brutality of the crime, the judge continued, and the clear evidence presented leave this court with no alternative. Others simply stared in stunned silence from the back of the courtroom. An old man rose shakily to his feet, holding onto the leash of a massive Belgian Malinois. The dog, named Bars, whined as Alina turned to look at them. "Papa," she said softly, "take care of him. Don't let them put him down." Major Anatoly Morozov, Alina's father and a retired army engineer, nodded silently. And sunken from too many sleepless nights, locked with his daughters, barked, low and mournful, pulling against the leash. Alina's lawyer, Anton Vasilev, tried to speak, to file an objection, but Alina laid a hand on his arm. "Don't," she whispered. "They don't want the truth." He had served beside her through it all, through battles, field hospitals, and the long nights of pain and nightmares. Like her, he had been branded as dangerous. What the public didn't know was what Alina had tried to expose before the murder. Colonel Sokolov had been involved in suppressing reports of sexual abuse in their unit. He had threatened Alina when she refused to falsify a medical report. She had collected proof emails, statements, even a voice recording, but none of it had made it to court. The judge had declared the material inadmissible, saying it would bias the jury. The only thing that had been admitted was her presence near the colonel's house, her fingerprints on a glass and a blood-stained scarf. With her DNA, it all looked damning, all looked simple. And yet, to anyone who knew Alina, it was as the courtroom emptied. Bars lay down on the cold tile floor and refused to move. Anatoly tried to tug him gently, but the dog growled low, staring at the courtroom door where his handler had vanished. "He's waiting," said Anatoly quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "He knows she's innocent." Prison walls closed around Alina like a tomb. High brick barriers topped with barbed wire sliced into the gray Moscow sky. Winter crept through the cracks in the concrete like a ghost, biting into her bones. She didn't complain. After all, the pain reminded her she was still alive. For now, inside cell block D, she was an outsider among the damned. Most inmates either feared her or hated her. Former soldier, a supposed murderer, a woman in a man's world. The guards gave her no special treatment. They tossed her meals like scraps and left her out during head counts just to humiliate her. But Alina endured it all silently. Every night she replayed the events in her head, not the trial, but the days leading up to the colonel's death. What had she missed? Where had the truth vanished? Outside the prison, Bars had refused to adjust. At Anatoly's home, the dog paced restlessly, whining at doors, staring out windows, barking at shadows. He wouldn't eat unless Anatoly hand-fed him. At night, he curled into the corner of Alina's old room, nose pressed against the cold floor, as if trying to catch her scent. Anatoly, too, had become a ghost of himself. His wife, Yelena, had died years ago, and now the state had taken his only child. He had spent 30 years solving military engineering puzzles, designing bridges under fire, defusing landmines in Chechnya. He couldn't figure out how to. Something felt wrong, too clean, too fast. The murder had happened just 2 days after Alina submitted an internal complaint to the defense ministry. Then the colonel was dead. The investigation took barely a week. No one in the military had testified on her behalf. In fact, many of them had refused to even be interviewed. One evening, while reviewing the file again, Anatoly heard a scratch. At the door, Bars was sitting there with something in his mouth, Alina's old service pouch. Anatoly opened it and found a folded slip of paper hidden inside the lining. On it was a list of names, some were underlined. Beside them, "What is this?" he whispered. He didn't know it yet, but it was her personal trail of breadcrumbs, a coded list of witnesses. All former service members stationed under Colonel Sokolov, who had either seen or experienced the abuse Alina had been trying to expose. Each underlined name had agreed to speak. The ones with dots, they had gone silent after being threatened. Anatoly stared at the paper for a long time, then looked at Bars. "You led me to this, didn't you?" The dog barked once sharply. That night, Anatoly made a decision. He wasn't going to wait for the legal system to right its wrongs. It never would. If anyone was going to save Alina, it would be Hamad, the dog who refused to give up on her. For several days, Ilya barely slept. His once quiet home had turned into an investigative nerve center. Old maps were spread across the dining table. Military case files and tribunal records, long forgotten in dusty archives, now found new life in Ilya's hands. Sophia joined him, organizing files and compiling timelines. Taras rarely left Misha's side, often sitting beside the dog and talking softly to him. They needed help. So Ilya reached out to someone he had once trusted with his life, Major Dmitry Antonov, a fellow veteran who now worked in military legal affairs in St. Petersburg. Ilya and Sophia traveled there, carrying a folder filled with what they had gathered so far: surveillance footage, timestamps, inconsistencies in forensic analysis, and most importantly, Dasha's diary, smuggled out from her old dorm room with the help of a friend. Major Antonov examined every document carefully. His expression grew increasingly grim as he read. "This wasn't just a rushed investigation," he said at last. "It was manipulated. Witness testimonies weren't just omitted, they were altered. I recognized some of the handwriting on the signed witness statements. These were rewritten after the fact." Sophia's voice was a whisper. "Then they lied to lock her away." "They didn't just lie," Antonov replied. "They buried her. Whoever orchestrated it had influenced high up that night." Antonov sent a report to the prosecutor general's office, quietly initiating an independent review. But the truth wasn't ready to surface without resistance. Next day, Ilya's home in the village was vandalized, windows shattered. A threatening message painted in red across the outer wall. "Stop digging." It only strengthened their resolve, while waiting for the legal review. Ilya took Atlas back to the abandoned warehouse near where the victim's body had been found. Ilya followed the dog's instincts. With a crowbar, managed to open a narrow maintenance hatch. Inside was a mess of forgotten. Ilya opened it with trembling hands. Lebedev had been the chief investigator on Dasha's case, the very man who claimed to have secured her confession. Ilya brought the coat to Antonov, under strict chain of custody. The blood was tested and matched the victim's. With that, everything began to fall apart. Antonov's petition for retrial was accepted by the regional court. The news came to Dasha in the cold gray walls of the penitentiary. She sat in stunned silence, her pale hands trembling as her lawyer read the letter aloud. Her expression was unreadable. "They believed me?" "No," her lawyer said gently. "But your father did, and he gave them no choice." The retrial began in winter. Snow blanketed the streets of Novgorod. Journalists lined the courthouse steps. Protesters stood outside with signs demanding justice for Dasha Orlova. Inside, the courtroom was silent as new evidence was presented. The GPS logs from Atlas's vest showed he had been by Dasha's side the entire evening of the crime. Surveillance footage previously ignored now revealed a shadowed figure resembling Investigator Lebedev entering the warehouse shortly before the murder. Testimony from a whistleblower linked Lebedev to the victim's deaths and a motive. When the court viewed the blood-stained coat with Lebedev's name tag, the silence was heavy with tension. In a moment of dramatic wait, Taras was called to testify. The boy stood bravely, holding his mother's photo. "She would never hurt anyone," he said, his voice shaking but firm. "She saved lives in the army. She saved mine when I was born. She's not what they said. Not what they said." When the verdict was announced, the entire room held its breath. Dasha Orlova is found not guilty on all charges. The courtroom erupted. Sophia wept openly. Ilya's legs gave way, and he dropped into a chair as tears streamed down his face. Taras leapt forward and wrapped his arms around his mother as she stepped forward from the defendant's bench. Dasha collapsed to her knees, arms around her son, her voice hoarse. "I never stopped believing I'd come back to you." Outside the courthouse, Atlas barked once, proudly, though he too had waited for this moment all along. But their story wasn't over. Corruption charges were filed against those involved in the cover-up, including former prosecutor Danilov and investigator Lebedev. Antonov's report became part of national headlines, sparking reforms in how military cases were reviewed, and Dasha returned home not just to her house, but to herself. Her medals, once hidden away, now hung with pride. She joined a new organization advocating for wrongly accused veterans. Taras began writing essays about justice, courage, and the strength of family, and Ilya Orlov. He sat on his porch most mornings, coffee in hand, with Atlas at his feet. Sometimes they said nothing at all. Other times, Ilya would whisper, "We did it, boy." And the dog would look up, eyes full of loyalty and quiet understanding. As dawn broke over the sleepy Russian town of Karamsk, a cold mist clung to the ground. Oleg's house, once a quiet refuge, was now buzzing with anxious energy. Dana, Major Tatiana Volkova, of the Internal Military Investigation Department, IMID, reviewed the evidence spread out on the kitchen table: reports, audio files, security footage backups, and the bloodied glove found by Roy, the dog that had come to symbolize Oleg's innocence. Sergeant Ivan Sidorov, Oleg's loyal friend, stood by the window, scanning the street. "They're getting nervous," he said, his voice tight. "2 black government cars drove by already this morning. They know we're getting close." Tatiana didn't flinch. "Good, let them sweat. This time they won't cover it up." She turned to Roy, who was lying quietly, but with alert eyes beside Oleg's military jacket. "It still amazes me," she said softly. "This dog has done more investigative work than half the division." Ivan smiled faintly. "He's trained to protect. He knows who's good and who isn't." Just then the front door opened and Oleg's daughter, Anya, came in holding a USB stick. "This came in an envelope addressed to you," she said, handing it to Tatiana. "No return address." It was shoved through the back gate. Tatiana plugged it into her laptop. A video loaded. The grainy footage showed an office meeting. Colonel Pavel Doroshenko, the man who had replaced Major Lavrov, sat with 2 other officers. They spoke quietly, but the voices were clear. "We can't let the appeal go through. The veteran has too much public sympathy." "What about the girl?" "She's being watched. One slip and we'll silence her too." It was damning. Tatiana immediately began downloading backups and preparing an encrypted copy. "This is it," she said. "This, the blood sample, the glove, the GPS data. We've got enough to rip their lies apart." Anya's hands trembled slightly. "Will it be enough to save him?" Tatiana looked up, locking eyes with her. "It will, but we'll need to move fast." At the regional courthouse in Vladivostok, a hearing was scheduled to review Oleg's appeal. The courtroom was packed. Military personnel, reporters, civilians. People who had heard the whispers about a hero being sacrificed to protect the reputation of higher officers, those who believed he was guilty. Oleg, pale but upright, was brought into the courtroom in chains. His expression was calm, but his eyes scanned for Roy, who had been barred from the courtroom due to regulations. Ivan sat in the front row, clutching a folder filled with documents and photos. Anya sat beside him, her hand resting on Roy's head outside the building, just near the back entrance. When Tatiana entered, murmurs rippled through the crowd. She wasn't in uniform, but carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had nothing left to prove. The judge called the session to order. Tatiana stepped forward. "Your Honor, I request to submit new evidence that completely overturns the basis of the original conviction against Oleg Baranov." The judge raised a skeptical brow. "On what grounds?" "Multiple grounds. First, the GPS data that places Baranov nowhere near the crime scene at the time of death. Second, physical evidence, including a glove containing the victim's blood and another man's DNA, found miles from the official crime scene. Third, and most crucial, this video," she said, raising the USB stick. The judge signaled for the video to be played. As the courtroom watched the footage, silence fell, then gasps. "It Colonel Doroshenko and others had manipulated evidence and ensured a scapegoat was chosen to protect higher ranks. The prosecution's lead attorney stammered, This could be fabricated. But Tatiana was prepared. She called an independent analyst who confirmed the file's authenticity, including metadata that proved it had not been tampered with. Still, the prosecution pushed back, claiming motive and previous testimony justified suspicion. But then, Ivan rose with the final blow. We tracked the original body cam files from the soldiers who first responded. No, they were never submitted into evidence. In one of them, a voice is heard saying, "It's done. The veteran will take the fall." The courtroom erupted. Later that day, the judge reconvened. Oleg stood, shoulders back. His face was unreadable, but Roy, who had been allowed in as a support animal, sat by his side, calm but alert. "This court acknowledges a miscarriage of justice," the judge said. "A conviction against Captain Oleg Baranov is hereby overturned. All charges are dismissed. An independent inquiry into military prosecution misconduct will commence immediately." Oleg didn't react at first, but when Anya ran to him and wrapped her arms around his waist, he lowered his head onto her shoulder. Silent tears slid down his cheeks. The gallery applauded. Ivan squeezed his eyes shut in relief. Tatiana stood still, her mission complete. Roy barked once sharp, proud, final. Epilogue. Weeks later, Oleg walked again, aided by a cane and his daughter's unwavering support. He had returned to his home in Kuromsk, choosing peace over vengeance. Colonel Doroshenko and several others had been suspended pending trial for corruption, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. Tatiana returned to her investigative post. But her name was now whispered with respect across every corner of the military judiciary. Anya began writing a book about her father's story, not just to clear his name, but to shed light on how many other heroes had been silenced. Roy. He remained faithfully by Oleg's side, his mission fulfilled, but his loyalty unchanged, in a small town filled with memories and wounds. One truth remained unshaken. Justice may be slow, but it can still roar, and sometimes that roar begins with the growl of a dog who never stopped believing in his master. Months passed. The snow that once covered the roads of Kuromsk had melted into spring soil, and the trees were beginning to bloom again. Life was slowly returning to normal for Captain Oleg Baranov, but he would never be the same. His home was no longer just a place of silence and loneliness. Anya had moved back in, helping him with recovery and encouraging him to speak at veteran gatherings. Roy remained ever present, a symbol not just of loyalty but of the truth that refused to die quietly. Oleg had received letters from strangers across the country, soldiers, students, families who had followed his case. Some told him how they had once believed he was guilty, but after hearing the full story, they felt ashamed and inspired. Others thanked him for standing tall even when the world turned against him. Still, Oleg kept a low profile. The pain of betrayal by his own uniform ran deep. The military had taken years of his life and then tried to bury him under lies. He had chosen not to be bitter. His strength now lived not in shouting or proving anything but in walking with his head held high, regardless of the scars left behind. One afternoon, as the sun fell behind the horizon, Oleg stood in the garden he had once left overgrown. Now it was freshly tilled, flowers planted by Anya, and a bench placed beneath the old birch tree. He sat there. Roy curled at his feet, watching the breeze move gently through the leaves. Ivan arrived with 2 cups of tea and handed one to Oleg. They sat quietly, sipping, their silence filled with understanding. They asked if you'd come to Moscow. Ivan finally said, to receive the official apology and Medal of Honor. Big ceremony. Media and all. Oleg took a sip. I already have what I need. Ivan nodded. I figured you'd say that. Anna came outside with a small box in her hands. Papa, she said, smiling, I want to show you something. Inside the box was a printed manuscript. The cover read, The Veteran Who Stood Alone, a true story of honor and injustice. By Anya Baranova. Oleg stared at it for a long moment. You finished it? I did. And publishers are already interested. He reached out, touching the cover. Lightly, make sure it's the truth, even the hard parts. It is, Papa, she said, hugging him, and it's yours. Far away in Moscow, investigations continued. Several high-ranking officials were removed and reforms were promised, but Oleg didn't watch the news anymore. He had seen what real justice looked like, not in headlines, but in the eyes of those who stood by him when he had nothing left. In the end, he wasn't just a soldier who survived a war. He was a man who survived betrayal, lies, and injustice. And he did so without ever raising his voice in anger. He got up without saying,